Hello, and welcome to this presentation about the Housing Act 2004 for the benefit of fire and rescue services. My name is Jonathan Herrick. I'm the Principal Fire Engineer for the Joint Inspection Team, and I have 26 years of experience in the fire and rescue service and 30 years in the fire industry in total. I shall now introduce my colleague, Richard Chubb.
Hello, my name is Richard Chubb. I'm Principal Environmental Health Officer in the Joint Inspection Team. I've worked in the team for approximately 2.5 years, and prior to that I was a Principal Environmental Health Officer at Nottingham City Council. The National Fire Safety Joint Inspection Team was set up in 2019 as the government's post-Grenfell response. It's paid for by the Department for Levelling Up and Housing Communities, and we're based and employed by the Local Government Association. We are effectively employed to parachute into local authorities and assist them with inspecting and enforcement of tall buildings.
The aim of this presentation is to enhance the knowledge and understanding of fire safety inspecting officers of the powers available under the Housing Act 2004 and how those powers can be used in conjunction with fire safety law to make buildings safer for residents.
The objectives of this presentation today are to help Fire and Rescue Service inspecting officers to better understand the legislative landscape in relation to housing, Housing Act 2004 and the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, which is made under regulations under the Housing Act, to help understand relevant matters that inform the assessment, and to understand what we mean by likelihood and harm outcomes which feed into the assessment. Areas of enforcement underneath the Housing Act and the powers of entry that are available to officers who are authorised under the Housing Act 2004. The compliance with approved document B does not always mean that the building is totally safe, and how the fire and rescue services can work in partnership with environmental health officers for the benefit of their communities.
We'll start with a brief overview of the various laws that relate to housing. A natural start point feels like the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. The Fire and Rescue Service should be very familiar with the Fire Safety Order. While it's principally a workplace law, a point which has really not changed in recent years, it has some relevance to non-workplaces. In particular, parts of domestic premises used in common by the occupants of more than one such dwelling. The order centres about the provision of general fire precautions that should be identified from undertaking an assessment of risk from fire in premises to which the order applies. The duty to take general fire precautions is imposed on the responsible person, as defined at Article 3, and further duties are imposed on other people at Article 5. While there's a duty to comply, where necessary, with Articles 8 to 22 and any regulations made under Article 24, the minimum standard to be established through the law is that required for life safety. The Fire Safety Act 2021 has been recently introduced. It clarifies the scope of the fire safety order and applies to premises that contain 2 or more sets of domestic premises. The scope is clarified insofar as it applies to the structure, external walls, including cladding and balconies. It also applies to individual flat entrance doors between the domestic premises and common parts of multi-occupied residential buildings. For both areas that have been clarified, the Act makes no provision for additional powers of entry to fire safety inspecting officers. For example, to inspect balconies up close, to get close to external walls to see what they're made from, or indeed to inspect and look at front doors of individual flats. The Act also clarifies that compliance with government guidance tends to imply that there was no contravention, and that failure to comply with government guidance might tend to indicate the presence of a contravention. Finally, the Act conferred power to make further changes to the fire safety order and to the premises to which it applies.
Okay, so the Housing Act 2004 applies to all housing stock. It's mostly used by local authorities to regulate private landlords, but it can be used to assess and enforce against social landlords as well. The Housing Health and Safety Rating System, the HHSRS, is used to assess 29 different hazards. The Joint Inspection Team effectively only really assesses the hazard of fire in tall buildings. So as part of the assessment, we assess the likelihood and the harm outcomes, and we use a numerical calculation to calculate a hazard score. That is then turned into a banding, which is a letter from A to J, with A being the most serious, J being the least serious. The addendum to the Housing Act 2004 was produced post-Grenfell and assisted to clarify how local authorities should use the HHSRS to assess tall buildings.
The Fire Safety England regulations 2022 are yet to come into force, coming into force in January of 2023. These regulations further outline the overlap of fire safety law with housing. Within the regulations, 3 height thresholds are established, applicable at 18 metres, 11 metres and to all buildings, with rules applicable to each height threshold. The new requirements relate to wayfinding signage, the provision of information to residents, which builds on the provision of information that should be provided to employees under the fire safety order already, and various requirements in relation to fire doors and fire door surveys and the provision of information. There are also requirements made in relation to 2 new terms: key firefighting equipment and essential firefighting equipment. These 2 terms use the words firefighting equipment in a different way from that in which the order has historically applied them. So that is something for fire and rescue services to look out for when enforcing the new regulations. The Building Safety Act is a huge piece of legislation which has been in production since the Grenfell Tower tragedy. In all likelihood, you'll be well aware of the upcoming Building Safety Act, which will deal with higher risk buildings with respect to fire and structural risks. It will apply a safety case model to buildings and will regulate those risks using a building safety regulator. The Health and Safety Executive will be the home of the new BSR, and they will establish multidisciplinary teams consisting of the Health and Safety Executive, Building Control, Fire Services and, maybe, housing authorities. Using the multidisciplinary teams, the BSR will regulate the buildings in scope of the Act. We do not have time here to go into detail of the Building Safety Act, but the last few slides should have made it very clear that the landscape of regulation in housing is changing, and that there will be several layers and several different routes to fire safety enforcement in certain subsets of housing. The next few slides will give more information about the Housing Act in particular, before we touch on joint working and more technical detail of the Housing Act to better aid your understanding of it.
So the Housing Act 2004 confers powers on inspectors to enter residential premises at any reasonable time, but must give at least 24 hours notice when the inspection will take place. The inspection can consider parts of the residential premises used in common by the residents and access to individual flats. If access is refused, the local authority can obtain a warrant to inspect from the Magistrates' Court. EHOs can take with them any person who they feel is necessary to assist them in the carrying out of their duties. Those with specific skills that might contribute to their understanding and interpretation of risk. This power to take others with them could be a useful function to fire safety inspectors. if they want to take a closer look at the fire safety hazard posed by external walls, balcony construction or front doors. In common with the fire safety order, EHOs have a power under the Housing Act 2004 to take samples of materials to require the production of documents. Documents required for production must exist already. EHOs cannot require the writing of new documents that do not exist under section 235. So, the HHSRS system and the hazard of fire. So the things that we consider are initially the likelihood. So the likelihood is of a resident suffering harm from a fire. So as you'll see on the table here, these are our representative scale points for likelihood. The national average for a typical 1979 block, which is most of the housing stock that we are assessing, is in this band here, so 1,800. So we assess relevant matters within the building. This may include things like absence of or non-functioning fire detection. It might include non-functioning communal automatic fire detection. It could include non-functioning or poorly maintained smoke control system. It also includes about 30 relevant matters in total. I'm not going to go through them all today. They're all included within the addendum to the HHSRS. So if we could just go back to that last slide, as we get more and more problems with our relevant matters, so we normally score these from 0 to 3. 0 being no problem with it, 3 being it's seriously defective. So as we look at this representative scale point, which is our likelihood, from the average building, we then move this down and choose what we think is most representative, considering how many issues we've got with our relevant matters. So how bad a building is. Some relevant matters are going to affect the fire safety more than others. For example, the external wall system. If there's a lot of combustibles on the outside of the building, and it's close to places where fires can start and it can pass between windows on the building, for example, that's going to have a larger effect on the building, effectively. So, so a problem with that would increase our likelihood considerably. Something like if you saw a couple of penetrations that were poorly fire stopped, for example, it's not going to have a massive effect on the entire building. So we consider them to probably have less effect. So if you just saw that, you might just move it to 1 in 1,000, for example. If you saw a combustible wall system completely encapsulating the building with a broken fire detection system, say for example with poorly fitted fire doors, then we're going to be moving it down here to the higher likelihoods. Okay, next slide. This is the HHSRS formula. You'll see here the class of harms. This effectively means there's 4 classes of harm. Class 1 is the most serious, which is death or permanent disablement or in a coma, for example. Going down to serious burns, less serious burns with fires, or maybe just some mild smoke inhalation for class 4. You don't need to memorise this. It's calculated effectively by a spreadsheet. This is a fraction of, so the 1 over the likelihood. So if you've chosen 1 in 100, for example, it's 1 over 100. That's then multiplied by the spread of harm. So when we choose our rating for that. Okay, next slide. So from that, when we calculate the hazard score, it's a numerical score. We then compare it to our hazard band. So if, for example, we've scored it and it's come to 980, it's within this band here, so that would then correspond to a D, so band D. So bands A to C are category 1 hazards, bands D and below are category 2 hazards. So what do we mean by a category 2 hazard and category 1 hazard? So category 1 hazards are the more serious hazards. Category 2 are less serious, councils are under a duty to take action under Category 1, and under Category 2 the authority may and has a power to enforce, but it needs to be reasonable. So if we had, for example, a J and you're requiring them to spend £10 million on the repair of that, for example, that might not be proportionate, I think is the word. The more serious hazards, for example, councils will be considering whether or not there's an imminent risk, and if there's an imminent risk, it affects what enforcement action we take after that. So the Housing Act 2004 provides a power of entry for local authority officers. EHOs have to be authorised by the council via delegated powers, just as the fire safety order confers powers of entry on inspectors. Both pieces of legislation give a power of entry to parts of premises used in common by the occupants of more than one dwelling. Whereas the order facilitates access to areas used in common at any reasonable time, the powers of entry from the Housing Act requires a notice served under Section 239 and 24 hours notice. If the Section 239 notice is served on owners and occupiers of dwellings, access under the Housing Act can be gained to those dwellings. If fire inspectors were to accompany EHOs, this access would enable inspectors around the building. This access would also allow fire inspectors to see if a temporary alarm is in place in the dwelling and to inspect the front doors of individual flats. We note that powers of fire and safety inspectors have not been extended under the current fire safety laws. Joint working to overcome access issues could be mutually beneficial. In practice, less than 24 hours notice can be given, but access can be refused, and even if access is granted, the information obtained could not lead to the serving of an enforcement notice. Common parts could be inspected, emergency action could be taken. The greater notice required by the Housing Act when compared to the fire safety order is because it principally concerns access to people's homes. Our experience to date is that occupiers of private blocks welcome the fire safety team into their homes if we are flexible with them. For example, they may need to tidy up or ventilate or climb out of the shower and get changed. This is aided by being personable, and we wear protective face masks during periods of COVID. It is also important to understand the limits and scope of the Housing Act 2004. Only deficiencies with premises, i.e. the fabric of the building, that give rise to a risk of harm to residents can be enforced. The scope is such that there is nothing precluding the local housing authority, the council, from requiring any measure to be taken if it will reduce the risk, including the installation of facilities and equipment for the fire and rescue service, which of course is something that fire safety inspectors cannot require under the fire safety order.
Having said that, the Housing Act cannot require ongoing maintenance or other management-related issues. The Act can request repairing maintenance to defective building systems, just not ongoing maintenance or management controls, including occupier behaviour issues, for example. By contrast, the fire safety order is useful to regulate maintenance under Articles 17 and 38, and management behaviours under Article 11, which the Housing Act cannot require. This includes, but is not limited to, the inappropriate storage of residents' belongings in cupboards, risers or corridors, introduction of new ongoing maintenance processes, etc.
This presentation aims to give an introduction to the Housing Act 2004, but we feel it might be helpful to touch briefly on joint working. As with any inspection, information and data might be available before the inspection takes place. Any information held by either party should be shared so that a common understanding is reached and everyone proceeds from the same starting point. Naturally, any sharing of data needs to comply with data sharing protocols and the law. Section 235 allows a local housing authority to require the production of documentation that the authority might need to carry out its housing enforcement functions, and also to investigate whether an offence has been committed in relation to residential premises. Note that the documentation is produced, not created, so the authority can only require documentation that already exists. Examples of existing information that might already be under the control of a duty holder include, but are not limited to, the fire strategy, the fire risk assessment, commissioning certificates, maintenance records and test certificates for any of the following. For example, the dry rising main, a wet rising main, emergency lighting, fire detection systems, other active and passive fire safety systems and lightning protection. Cause and effect schedules might be requested, plans of the building are often available, and information relating to solar PV which might be present on the roof. All documents required by the authority must be requested from the right person, meaning someone who might be reasonably expected to hold the document. Authorities should consider people who may hold the information, such as a duty holder, freeholder, head leaseholder, or the responsible person.
In all cases where a prescribed fire hazard exists and the local authority intends to take enforcement action, the local authority has a duty under Section 10 to consult with the local fire and rescue service to confirm that the requirements relating to fire safety are appropriate.
The sharing of skills, knowledge and experience across the team is very useful at all stages, and any joint inspections that ultimately result in a well-rounded conclusion and the best safety outcomes for residents. During the inspection and for the debrief, it's helpful to establish shared descriptors for such things as the different elevations of the building, both externally and internally, especially with more complex layouts. The cupboards and risers that will be referenced in any communications with the responsible persons, different staircase enclosures if there's more than one, and demised areas as well as any other building specific matters. By sharing experience and technical understanding, hazards can be identified and better communicated, and ultimately an agreed understanding of the risks posed by the building can be determined. On conclusion of the inspection, the findings of each agency should be discussed at an appropriate location. The discussion and sharing of understanding and priority concerns should be drawing from the specialisms, skills and experience across the team.
After the inspection, and if enforcement action is necessary, it is helpful to agree as early as possible which authority will take the lead and for which actions. Remember, the limitations of the Housing Act 2004, that it may only make requirements in relation to deficiencies in the building, but not in relation to ongoing management and maintenance. Decisions might relate to which legislation takes primacy, and if both apply equally, it might be preferable to use the legislation that offers the path of least resistance. In some cases, using the order might be quicker because notices are served on the responsible person or on the duty holder, whereas copies of some notices served under the Housing Act 2004 must be served on all people with a relevant interest in the building, which could be a huge administrative burden. There might be some required action that cannot be taken under one law, but can be done under the other. Together, there should be routes to address all requirements by using a combination of the Housing Act 2004 and fire safety laws. Clearly, each inspector from the respective authorities should make their own notes and complete their own administrative functions after the inspection. Having agreed terminology will help with note writing and especially when serving notices. If common terminology is used by both authorities, the reader will be better positioned to understand what is being required. Environmental health officers might be unfamiliar with tall buildings and the fire safety features used in them, so they might need help to understand the terms applicable and any notes that are shared with them. In addition, we find benefit to sharing notes made during the inspection between the people present. We find that note sharing between those present can act as an aid to memory or can spark further reflection and thoughts that contribute to the shared understanding of risk. Under the Housing Act, the improvement notice is served with two schedules. The first describes faults or risk, and the second, the works required to address the hazards. When notices have been drafted, it can be helpful for both authorities to read them through and be able to comment, to ensure that all the necessary or agreed points have been covered, and that if the required action is taken, the assessed risks will be reduced to a reasonably safe level, typical for the age of the building. Despite this being best practice, the local authority has a duty imposed by Section 10 of the Housing Act to consult with the local fire and rescue service before taking enforcement action in relation to a prescribed fire hazard. The requirement is to consult. They don't necessarily have to agree, but they are normally advised to. Fire safety inspectors might be well aware that just because a building once passed through building control process, it does not mean that the building is necessarily safe. It might even be said of some new buildings, especially where the statutory consultation with the fire and rescue service has been less than smooth. Inspectors may also be aware that it's not the role or duty of the building control body to comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations. That is the duty of the principal contractor, principal developer, etc. During our inspections of high-rise buildings, we have found many examples of buildings that passed through the building control process, but in which there were building safety hazards, both created through mismanagement of the building and hard-baked into the design of the building. In other cases, compliance with building regulations has been treated like a tick-box exercise, and the feature needed to satisfy the regulations does not in fact deliver safety in reality. We have noted this most often in relation to smoke control and other ventilation systems. We have seen ventilation provided to satisfy approved document B to the building regulations, but which in practice allows the wind to blow any smoke produced by a fire back into the building and into the means of escape routes. We have seen deviation from the agreed building plans, such that offices and dwellings are open to the staircase enclosure, and smoke ventilation that's locked behind a door. We've seen natural ventilation used inappropriately, and smoke shafts that don't extend above the roof level where the fire might spread to the roof itself, as well as smoke shafts that are combustible. The list goes on.
We frequently see smoke detection in common areas and wonder often what its function is. We often require the production of a cause and effect matrix for that system so that we can actually fully understand the sequencing and operation of those systems.
We see many facilities for use by the fire and rescue service, but sometimes the systems are poorly installed. So that, for example, the use of a dry rising main outlet would hold open an adjacent corridor door, or would prevent the door from being opened. So if it was necessary to evacuate people, they couldn't get out. We've seen firefighting lifts that have not been serviced, that lack some or many of the features of a firefighting lift, etc. We've seen dry rising mains in premises for which guidance would recommend wet rising mains. We see many issues with access to the perimeter of buildings, especially in connection with tackling fire in the external walls and access for high reach appliances.
We've seen riser cupboards containing various fire hazards that have poorly fitted fire doors, walls made of aluminium metal section framework holding plasterboard in place, where a fire would melt the aluminium frame and allow the plasterboard to fall out. It's also impossible to inspect a building for fire safety without finding issues with fire doors, or doors intended to be fire doors, whether it be excessive gaps, missing screws, incorrect vision panels, broken self-closing devices, etc., etc. We have seen penetrations going through compartment walls and into false ceilings, including gas pipes in the firefighting shaft.
Compartment floors can be let down by penetrations that are improperly fire stopped. An issue with converted buildings or buildings to which floors have been added is with the fire resistance of the compartment floors, for example. Where the previous building had a requirement for 60 minutes of fire resistance, with subsequent floors added to it, the new height threshold might require 90 minutes of fire resistance to the structure and to the floors. Frequently in such cases, the fire resistance to the structure of the lower section of the building is not enhanced to match the new building height. We also see penetrations in the floors above basement car parks, for example, such that a car fire could penetrate through the floor into the dwellings above. We've even seen a service shaft clad internally on between 3 and 4 of the walls of the shaft with chipboard, open at the basement car park, such that a car fire would spread up the shaft like a chimney, spreading to the fire in the chipboard in the cupboard of each residential floor.
More often than not, wall openings for doors are constructed much larger than the door frames fitted into them. The resulting gap between the wall opening and the door frame is often not filled at all or filled with inappropriate material that has no fire resisting properties, so that the only protection to the residential corridor from a fire in the cupboard is the architrave that's facing to the corridor.
The evacuation method can be cause for concern. Not only staying put when simultaneous would be better, but also changes from stay put to simultaneous without thinking it through, or with instruction to report to an assembly point, which doesn't exist, or report to a non-existent fire marshal. This subject links to the NFCC guidance on changing evacuation strategies in buildings, which is not always taken into consideration.
In another example, during the building control process, an atrium space was suggested by the developer as being the same as outside space for the purpose of balcony access to flats. The atrium had a permanently open vent in the vertical plane, as you can see here, through which the prevailing wind blew. So the southwesterly was blowing straight into that and wouldn't allow it to function properly. The top of the atrium was closed with glazing. To our way of thinking, the atrium was not equivalent to a building with an external balcony approach.
Naturally, our work is targeted first and foremost on buildings with hazardous external walls, and for which there is no plan for remediation. As we've already shown, the external walls are only the start of the issues that can be found in these buildings, but it would be amiss of us to discuss the safety of tall residential buildings without at least mentioning the cladding, which should never have been combustible in the first place, but which, nonetheless, obtained building control approval in many cases. We have seen many wall coverings and layers, including ACM of various categories, expanded polystyrene, high-pressure laminate, combustible insulation, and missing or substandard cavity barriers, to name but a few. The fire safety order can deal with some of these findings, but others may be more difficult to address under the order. Remember, the Housing Act 2004 can go beyond the requirements of building regulations and associated guidance, and beyond fire safety guidance. As we have previously said, there is nothing precluding the local authority from requiring anything they think necessary.
So I mentioned earlier the relevant matters. So they are stated in the addendum to the HHSRS operating guidance. These include issues with absence of evidence that an external cladding system is non-combustible and extent of coverage, disrepair to the outer surfaces of the building. Lack of current, suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. Outstanding action points from the fire risk assessment. Lack of or non-functioning AFD and alarms in dwellings, in cases where individual dwellings are being inspected. Non-functioning or poorly managed and maintained smoke control systems in the common parts. This may include no record of weekly testing to BS 9999-2017. disrepair to the fabric of the building and any compromising of compartmentation, and the absence or inadequate record of dry, wet riser 6 monthly checks. So relevant matters to the hazard of fire in tall buildings includes services and service ducts that compromise compartmentation, services not in fire-resistant enclosures, non-fire resistant doors or badly maintained doors opening onto common parts, disrepair to refuse chute hoppers, sources of fuel, rubbish or other flammable material, external or internal, inadequate waste storage, opportunity for external intentional fire starting, external unintentional fire starting, for example, car fires, skip fires or barbecues on balconies, lack of controlled secured access to the building permitting unauthorised access and risk of arson. Matters that can be required to be improved include the following: removal of the existing cladding and or insulation and or cavity barriers. This is likely to then include installation of new external wall systems involving the need to comply with building regulations. There are obviously also Regulation 7 issues. We can't put old combustible insulation back on, and there's a complete ban on anything that's now not A1 or A2, B1, D0. It may require the replacement of balcony and terrace floors, including combustible elements of construction such as the beams and joists. Compartmentation and fire stopping survey and to address all of the issues found on those surveys. May also include additions to or existing or completely new fire detection systems in common parts or covering common and leasehold flats also. It may include a fire door survey and the requirement to repair or replace any defects found on that survey. It includes additional firefighting facilities such as a dry rising main or wet rising main, smoke control changes and repairs, including requiring changes to mechanical extraction and issues with pressure differentials in mechanical smoke control systems. As with the Housing Act is quite complex in terms of who we are required to serve the notice on, and if there's a right to manage company, it adds additional complexity. We're not going to go into detail of that today, but please be aware of that. If flats are demised to a leaseholder, including the front door, there may need to be a separate notice served on the leaseholder. This may include repairs to fire doors opening onto common parts, fire detection and alarms, including additional units in flats to comply with NFCC guidance, though that would normally form part of the overall improvement notice on the freeholder. Fire-resistant backplates to electrics on the inside face of external walls, if such work would offset a hazard posed to the external wall system. So the Act requires the authority to serve notices on a person who is an owner of the specified premises concerned and, in the authority's opinion, ought to take the action specified in the notice. Normally it's served on the freeholder, but not always. As I mentioned before, if there's a right to manage company, it adds a level of complexity because they aren't true owners of the building, yet they may have the right to do all of the repairs to the building. So be aware that there's case law surrounding this issue. Also, the same applies with resident management companies where they're responsible for repairs. So the council will need to take advice from their solicitors in such cases. So the powers available to the local authority under the Housing Act are relatively similar to those available to fire services under the Fire Safety Order. If there's an imminent risk in a building, there is something known as emergency remedial action. So this may include if the freeholder isn't immediately contactable, the council may employ the services of a fire alarm company to go in and get it back working or install temporary alarms. So please note that that requires an imminent risk, and quite often the fire service will need to provide that opinion as to whether or not there is an imminent risk. Emergency prohibition is also requires imminent risk, so again the fire service are likely to be consulted upon the risk posed by that defect. There's also a prohibition order, which takes 28 days to take effect if it's not appealed. If it's appealed, it may suspend that. An improvement notice is the most commonly used tool by the local housing authority. It imposes requirements to be addressed within certain time limits. So, for example, the council may serve a notice requiring the external wall system and insulation to be replaced within 18 months to 2 years. It's probably sensible at the moment due to shortage of contractors. So it needs to be reasonable. Another action is to serve an improvement notice and then suspend it. This may be used where councils are dealing with a trustworthy landlord, such as a university landlord, for example, where they can demonstrate to them that they have specified the works, have obtained planning permission, and are in the process of starting the works already. That will be then suspended until, for example, 18 months from the date of the notice. If they aren't starting works after those 18 months and it doesn't appear that they're going to start, you would then reserve a full improvement notice. Another option is to serve a hazard awareness notice. Now, this doesn't actually specify that the council has to address anything with it. It's literally just discharging responsibility from the council and formally notifying the responsible person, be it the freeholder, that a hazard is present in the building. There is also a demolition order. These are rarely used due to the cost of property, but may be used where the cost of works exceeds the actual value of the property. So thank you for your time today. Hopefully it's been useful to you. We've included our team email on here and our individual emails as well. If you have any specific questions about a building, or you'd like further advice on anything that we've covered today, please feel free to drop us an email. Over to you, John.
That's it. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.